Live streaming is on.
Okay. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome Mark Marino and Matthew Fuller or Faller.
Live streaming is on.
Okay. Okay. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome. Okay. Fuller or Faller?
Live streaming is on.
We will. No, I have to stop some.
Okay. Good morning or good evening.
Oh, there's some.
On where you are. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome.
Okay. Okay.
Streaming is on.
I don't know if there was a loop in audio. And I don't know if it depends on me, but I don't think so. And so, are you looking in YouTube? If so, please switch off the.
No? Yeah, not as yet, but I will not anyway. Okay, no, it's off. So
okay,
that is not.
Okay, I'm sorry. All is going well, donc, so we can start from the beginning. That's another time. I'm pleased to be here and to welcome you in CodeFest 2021. I will shortly try to introduce you with some texts that I noted before. Matthew Fuller is a professor of cultural studies at the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies of Goldsmiths University of London. He teaches digital media critical perspectives module. He was editor of Behind the Blip, essay on the culture of software, 2003, and also of Software Studies, a lexicon, 2008 for the Mid Press. Two books that, in my opinion, starts to put some bricks on the building of critical code studies. And Mark Marino is an associate professor of writing at the University of Southern California at San Diego, I suppose. He also directs the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab, a research group dedicated to humanities approach to the exploration of computer source code. Two books from Mark Marino, 10 print. How do you spell? I cannot spell this title.
Well, we can say 10 print for short.
But
one. Yes, 10 print char string 205.5 plus random one. Go to.
Okay, thank you. And 2013 and Critical Code Studies that is just came out in 2021. So that's said. If you like to start to explain us, because I think in Italy we are not so aware of what critical code studies are, and if you try to give us a broad context and then some example, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start, and I'm going to try and share a screen. I'm not quite familiar with this platform, but we'll see what happens.
Third from left.
Yeah, can you see some slides? in this. Can you see some slides?
Not as
Not-
yet.
Okay. Is that working? The power of the pandemic and human communication.
Right.
Okay, I have a very sophisticated lot of slides here. You just, your mind will be blown if you could see them, but it seems like it's not happening. Which is a pity. Okay, so I'm just going to try
So
one
is
more
it-
time.
So it means you cannot click the button, the start.
I've clicked the button. It says start
Right.
sharing your screen. Then select window or screen. It's only showing browser windows or the entire screen. So choose the entire screen and press allow. So wait a minute, let's try this. Is that working? No. Can you
Not
see?
yet.
Okay.
So one thing we could try, if you want to send the slides, and maybe one of us, like me, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that now. Sorry about this. Okay, so it's just coming over. Okay, so that's sent. What I'll do first of all then is give a kind of a little introduction. What I want to talk about really is thinking about the way in which software doesn't happen on its own, and really what I'm interested in is thinking about the kind of wider cultural formations in which computing, code, software takes place, and to think what are the kind of tools available to work with this condition. So traditionally, software is understood through mathematics, through logic, through a particular palette of philosophical thinking, and what a current of work that's emerged from the kind of the end of the 1990s to the beginning of this century has tried to develop is an argument that it can also be understood through a range of wider cultural practices and of a wider palette of theory. So ranging from continental philosophy through to kind of hacker practices, through to gender studies, critical race studies, cultural studies more broadly. So that's what I'm going to do is try and talk through not a kind of a history of that work or a genealogy of it, but to try and exemplify this in an argument that is best made with a set of slides. So this work starts to think about how software is networked in and part of wider systems in society, and exemplifies and intensifies them. So software is not a separate thing. This is great. Thank you. I want to start off by thinking about what the kind of culture that software is, or the kind of thinking that software is. And starting with a quote from a certain tradition in software design and programming, pattern thinking from Richard Gabriel, one of the people involved in developing a mode of writing software or thinking about software through patterns, through Christopher Alexander's pattern thinking, specifically in relationship to object-oriented programming. And what's interesting about this statement is that he's talking about a contextual way of thinking about software, the kinds of intellectual practices and ways of thinking that are articulated in software, and their wider relationship to wider social and intellectual forces. The reason I've called it, the title of the talk is Reason and Unreason in Software Thinking, NAND from the Boolean gate, to imply something that is both reason and unreason at the same time. Okay, if you have the next slide, please. What I'm going to start from is this book, which came out recently and has become a bestseller. And it's a way of thinking about trauma in contemporary society, the way that trauma is acknowledged and disavowed at the same time. And where I think this is a good starting point is because software is something and reason is something that changes over time. What we understand to be logical, what we understand to be a proper formulation of reality is something that changes throughout history. And what this book does is make a case for understanding reason in relationship to large-scale societal forces, specifically around the generation of trauma. So reason is always formulated in relationship to unreason. And specifically, we're thinking about in the present, the question of artificial intelligence. But we can also think about the mind of the user or the programmer. And reason is always formulated in relationship to unreason in different ways. Firstly, through being distinct, madness is distinct, or unreason is distinct from philosophy and right thinking. Reason is a means to identify unreason through things like medicine, psychiatry, psychology, and so on. And reason and unreason are both produced together through the workings of reason in modern society. And I want to kind of trace that movement of these two forces together. So there's a relationship between madness or unreason and reason that changes over time, that doesn't stay stable, and is also wider. And it's I want to think about what this might mean in relationship to code in the present. Now, Bessel van der Kolk's argument in this book, The Body Keeps the Score, which has become a very widely read book over the last year, is very, very interesting for thinking about different forms of abuse and violence in society. And part of his argument is that one of the preconditions for mass intellectuality, for the knowledge economy, in which the digitization of society relies upon and co-constitutes, is a response to mass trauma, that is, large-scale traumatic events such as wars. So Bessel van der Kolk sets out a history of their discipline as it relates to trauma. And the thesis is that over the course of the 20th century, the spread of the ability to think and to reason, to order arguments at a more abstract level, gave society the ability to deal with trauma. And these abilities arrive through changing techniques of diagnosis, but also broader social forces such as education that change our relationship to reason and democratize capacities of reason. Okay, so if the next slide, please. Thanks. So Kolk works in the United States, and he specifically draws on an Anglophone archive of texts and cases, and starts by looking at the First World War and looking at the diagnosis of shell shock, or what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In Britain, shell shock was specifically prescribed as a term by Field Marshal Haig, the guy on the right, the commander of the British forces, since it would imply that the state would, after the war, be responsible for caring for the mentally wounded as well as those of the physically wrecked. Instead, the stories of soldiers and the experiences of soldiers were repressed. The categories of diagnosis for conditions such as shell shock were removed by official order, and they were replaced with the term cowardice, a term, a diagnosis that was treated by execution on the front line. The generation that came out of that war would often not speak about it. We can think of, for instance, Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a book written in the trenches, whose punchline is, "Of what we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent." And think of the history of Wittgenstein's philosophical career as an attempt to negotiate this relationship to silence. The mainstream view was, and the view held by Haig and the ruling classes of Europe at that time, was not that war was horrific and must be opposed. Rather, those who suffered were not adequate warriors. Could I have the next slide, please? This experience was counteracted by much of the art that followed in the 1920s. These are two pictures by the German artist Otto Dix. And you can see the image of the wounded soldiers returned from the front playing cards with many of their body parts replaced by technologies, hearing aids, mechanical parts of bodies ranging from jaws to legs to hands. So technology becomes deeply implicated not only in the cause of war, but also as the treatment of war. Could you have the next slide, please? Yeah, thanks. After the Second World War, Van der Kolk's account continues, partly caused by the response and the disparities imposed at Versailles after the First World War, many industrialized societies attempted to deal with their structure in one way or another. Could I have the next slide, please? The Marshall Plan was an imperialist project, but it was also an attempt to generate a less conflicted society through certain kinds of conformism, which we can see well illustrated here, and also a notion of some kind of progress for all members of society, the one whose aim was to consolidate capitalism as a basic template for society. You can see in this poster the idea of the proper upbringing through being taped to an upright piece of wood, and the term élevé, elevation, or the growing up of or proper growth of the society. So this idea was that the right and reasoned management, the orthogonal management of a society, was the new purpose after the Second World War. Parallel to this, the mass program of education in the Soviet Union and a wider belief in the value of the humanities was a driving force in the formation of the society. In this term, mass intellectuality arises out of more or less systemic responses to mass trauma. Could I have the next slide, please? In the United States, the GI Bill for returning troops provided education as a basic right for soldiers who'd fought in Europe. But also, following this, this led to a wider formation of intellectuality spread through society as reason found different forms of expression, for instance, in the countercultures of the 1950s, such as the Beats, and forms of mass intellectuality who dealt with societal trauma in non-state terms. For instance, the long strand of feminism in that era, the generations of the 50s to the 1980s, which produced a reckoning with patriarchy and the rationalization of war. Could you have the next slide, please? Van der Kolk goes on to argue that in the 1960s and 1970s, the war in Vietnam produced a trauma that roamed through society, but that was modified through numerous modes of reason, advances in psychiatric treatment and discourse about the topic that changes the object of study, that is trauma, from something that must be repressed to something that can be spoken about and understood. It was also a war that was highly mediated, as we can see in this photo from Life magazine. a mediation that was not repeated and probably will not be repeated due to the distrust in the war that it generated. So knowledge breeds a distrust of power in this sense. Trauma at this point was, if in the First World War, trauma was treated by disavowal, by silence and repression. In the Second World War was treated by mass access to education. In the 1960s, there was a further development of access to education and literacy, but also through medication and extension of psychiatric treatment, and rather than internment in asylums. You can see the movement of anti-psychiatry in the United Kingdom and Italy, for instance, with people like Franco Basaglia and R.D. Laing, amongst others, re-articulated a relationship between reason and trauma in this period. Trauma was understood also to be culturally constructed in that it can be expressed. Expression means to form and to work on trauma and neurosis. Society and individuals must be given the means to do so. In the present, the push towards recognition of mental health and the traumatic production of contemporary society is a further move. So at each of these steps, there's a change in the equation between reason and unreason. What falls into one category or the other, what is able to speak, and what is impelled to remain silent. Bessel van der Kolk's thesis is that there is a gradual change in the possibility of speaking. The development of literacy about trauma and of the way it's registered in bodies alongside changes that register in the level of the political, pharmaceutical, and the psychological. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. And one thing that Stefano asked us to talk about was the nature of work in relationship to code. And in his email, he specifically asked us to talk about the way in which the changes in work from the production line to the condition of mass intellectuality or the knowledge economy change our understanding of machines and of reason. And if the factory produced one idea of reason and the one way of ordering human labor, human experience, and the forces of production for a certain kind of rationality, we can say that code reworks the nature of reason of the production line. I wanted to mention Nanni Ballestrini's novel We Want Everything, Vogliamo Tutti, from 1971, because it kind of epitomizes in some ways some of this tension, this movement or this climax of the factory as the focus of production to a new phase in society of mass intellectuality. Ballestrini's work is, of course, as you'll well know, is based around the Mirafiori factory in Turin, a book that came out in 1971. And it's a novel it really kind of shows the demand for meaningful work, the demand for the end to dehumanization of the factory, and something that talks directly about the playfulness of political struggle and political struggle as a form of imaginative play in society. The movement that Ballestrini was part of, and we should say also that Ballestrini was one of the first novelists to experiment with computer-generated fiction in his novel Tristano and in other texts. The kind of political window or opportunity that this movement opened up to think about the relationship between technology, society, culture, can be carried forward into thinking about the way in which code, technology more broadly, software as it epitomizes contemporary technology, crystallizes some of the key tendencies that we're thinking about. So I want to follow some of the argument that Ballestrini makes. First of all, workers use their own form of reason to decode the relations of power built into the machines on which they work and to attempt to reprogram the factory based on their collective strength. The intellect of workers outpaces the role that it's given in the factory. As a result, struggle spreads to wider aspects of life. So the role of the reason of the factory, the reason imposed by the factory owners, clashes with the reason that is developed by the workers in the factory, who then massify their struggle through bringing it to wider areas of life. What I want to argue is that there are equivalents in programming that we can look for, that crystallize some of the key questions in the contemporary post-factory workplace. And to do this, I want to look at the term knowledge work. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So Balzac, the novelist, used the term intelligential workers in his series of novels, the Comédie Humaine, that ran from 1829 to 1848. And his work traced the development of what Otto Neurath in this graphic calls clerical and other workers. So workers that are engaged in intellectual work. So work on codes, work on protocols, work on recording, analyzing, producing information. So this graphic from Otto Neurath is an early example of a kind of data visualization, and it's an attempt to show the changing nature of labor over the course of the late 19th to the mid 20th century. If we were to extend this graph into the present, you'd see that those in clerical, educational, informational, and other services vastly outnumber now those in agriculture and forestry. In the UK, around 2% of the population is engaged in agriculture in the present day. The vast majority are engaged in services or information processing, education, other services that are supposedly the space of the intellectual worker. So, could I have the next slide, please? The favored business theorist of Silicon Valley, Peter Drucker, started using the term knowledge worker at the end of the 1950s. But these were workers designed to fit into a large company with specialist skills. Drucker was talking particularly about lawyers, engineers, accountants, managers, people who work with information and formal structures. These were institutional knowledge workers, what the Beat criticized as corporate man. They had some relationship to what the novelist Upton Sinclair called white-collar workers. And indeed, many of the ways we have for thinking about intellectual work and the kind of work that's become programmatic work or work with code in the present come from literature. The figure of the knowledge worker has changed again in recent decades. A prominent figure is in the Silicon Valley imagination is people whose roles took them laterally across business and technology. The ideal is an entrepreneur who sees a sweet spot between a technical possibility and a disintermediation of wealth that can be tapped into. I can have another next slide, please. A further articulation of this idea of the knowledge worker is the idea of future shock from Alvin Toffler, who looked at the expansion of knowledge work, what Drucker called knowledge work, in the 1970s. And his book, Future Shock, coined the term information overload, which Toffler argued was effectively a form of traumatic experience. Toffler argued that the rapid obsolescence of knowledge and social forms, the production of more and more disposable artifacts that are meaningless, cities become incomprehensible, society becomes unreadable to the present, and we communicate with our systems that increase the incomprehensibility of society to people. So information overload Toffler argues, is a point at which there is so much information saturates people's perception that it makes the society people live in incomprehensible. I would say there's an argument that this is parallel to a kind of trauma as articulated by Bessel van der Kolk. Marshall Berman, in his account of modernity, parallels this by saying there are two faces of modernity. One is ordering, regimentation, reason, rationality, industrialization. The other is the face of confusion, collage, and the deep depths of the individual, which are both imaginative and traumatized by the very reason of society. This kind of argument is taken up by other theorists such as Paul Virilio in his book The Information Bomb, where the experience of information society can itself be traumatic, and indeed, in the case of informational weapons, is designed specifically to be traumatic. Have the next slide, please. This is something picked up very well by the Italian cyberpunk artist, Professor Bad Trip. So this idea that Toffler proposes of information overload is one that characterizes present society in certain ways. And it's a way into understanding the interrelation of the production of trauma as a social formation in relationship to the question of reason. So reason and unreason twined together in a different way. In present society, we talk a lot about the manifestations of stress, anxiety, depression, basic conditions generated in the incommensurable scales brought together in contemporary knowledge and information economies, and the ecological conditions in which we find ourselves in. This is something that Franco Berardi, Bifo, says in many books. Could I have the next slide, please? And it's something that's specifically brought together in the work of Paul Preciado, who says new networks of knowledge, we're looking specifically around the formation of gender in relationship to technologies, medical technologies, chemicals, as well as computer networks. Preciado argues that new networks of knowledge around chemicals, procedures, the management of reproduction, and the production of subjects around these technologies and how they can be used at variance to their intended use shift the technical production of particular notions of gender through the pill, hormone gels, and so on. And there is also a shift at the same time in modes of control, from a disciplinary apportioning and segregation of spaces and practices, for instance, around sex allowed in marriage only, to sex being allowed or produced everywhere in a society in a form of sexual overload, so long as it is tied into the reproduction of certain images, patriarchal norms, that sex involves shopping, and the lifelong consumption of certain pharmaceutical products. So sex, like trauma, is no longer repressed, but is built into everything. This is something that is enhanced in Preciado's argument via computational technologies. So how does this relate to computational literacy, code and computer literacy? Go to the next slide, please. One of the books that's most interesting, I would say, in tracking this, or something like this kind of argument, is Annette Wei's book, Coding Literacy, which gives a history of the notions of computer literacy in the United States over the course of the late 20th century. Each chapter in this book argues for a different phase in the notion of computer literacy or of coding literacy, and shows how it exemplifies different kinds of social imperative, different kinds of context and political vocabulary. To go back to the idea of software thinking, each by Richard Gabriel, certain kinds of software thinking articulate different kinds of social context and a different kind of technical affordance that produces different kind of capacity for thinking, intensifying processes of subjectivation, whether they're traumatic or whether they're of reason, whether they're of reason or of unreason, are intensified by different notions of coding literacy. Next slide, please. Thank you. You've read my mind. The next slide is an example of two models of coding literacy, and you can see both of them involve an image of comfort, of pleasure, of children relaxing, playing with software objects, whether they're Seymour Pappert's famous turtles playing with the computer language logo, or they're more contemporary children working with Scratch. Both of them, in both images, the children are figured relaxing, playing, expressing themselves, expressing curiosity, but also deep focus and engagement in the technology. Both of these models, which are kind of historically related, exemplify an idea, a constructivist idea in psychology, drawn from the work of Vygotsky and others, looking at how the self expands into a social frame, the immediate surroundings. In the case of the child, expands into their immediate surroundings, into the society, into the affordances that the technologies provide for them, and into the context of the wider intellectual world that's set up by the social framework in which they exist. So in Wei's book, she argues that this idea of coding literacy has always been tied into the idea of what a society is and what a reasoning member of that society should be able to learn and should be able to expect. Okay, could I have the next slide, please? So part of the condition of the internet as a historical entity, originally, of course, a military technology, is the way in which it emerges from the society at war with itself and an approach by engineers and others to try to create, even within the limited space of the functioning of a technology, a space free from tyranny that is playful, that allows self-exploration. And they do this by a number of means. And there's a kind of ethical work within these different initiatives. First of all, if we think of specifically around the coding of the internet, the network structure of the internet is one in which all nodes are equal. The network is imagined as an open form that can simply be added to. The convention of adding new protocols to make a system work rather than obliterating older ones. There is a principle of rough consensus and running code as a means of organizing and evaluating whether something works or not. Could I have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry, the previous one. Thanks. Yeah, this culture of understanding coding as reflexive, as that tends to decentralize and lower hierarchies, and that code can be added to by anyone as an open source software, has become a constant kind of ethical imperative in much of the kind of the underlying culture of wiki software, of open source software, free software, and so on. And this understanding that computer literacy and coding is best done through curiosity-driven work that is iterative, that involves stakeholders, that involves a wide array of social participants, is one of the ways in which software culture has produced a way of dealing with the traumatic nature of society, or that the way that if coders decenter or de-hierarchicalize social forms, they're able to articulate the problems inherent to it. But this is a kind of a utopian tendency, but a very practical utopian tendency within coding culture, a very pragmatic tendency. And it also faces another tendency that is found in the internet in the present. And it's one of the problems that the internet faces in the present, especially in its form overly determined in English, is the movement of the mass traumatic working through of events on systems that are predicated on a highly banal understanding of what it is to be human. Facebook, for instance, with its excruciating reduction of the figure of the social. Given the complexity of the social processes underway at present, but given the simplifications that they're forced into, there are widespread social spasms occurring as a system that don't fit, that entrain social forces, from the scale of the entrainment of nervous systems to the construction of individual psyches, to the formation of new genres and formations of communication, to the consolidation or vociferation of social movements. Could have the next slide, please. In this context, another strategy emerges, a conservative one that sees humans as essentially flawed, rather than try to ameliorate trauma, unreason, or madnesses, or to engage with what is now termed mental health. Some politicians see it as axiomatic that the population is fundamentally mad, and that governance consists of interacting with this madness, of stirring it, of swimming in its vortexes, of gaming and profiting from it, rather than engaging in reason or in planning. We can see a kind of genealogy of this form of governance through Berlusconi as a primary exemplar, but also the father of the fathers of the contemporary genre, who are Trump on the one hand and Boris Johnson on the other. But more importantly, this role is not centered in individuals, but is farmed out to machine learning techniques that provide its kind of infrastructure. We have a society which rationalizes the relationship between reason and unreason through computational platforms that are built around the structures of asymmetric and non-standard warfare, that have disaster capitalism built into their foundations, that are entrained on fragile supply chains and ecological overuse, and in which networks are in part the architecture to sustain traumatic social conditions, that always keep an always available reservoir of crisis on the one hand, and provide a set of mechanisms for its intensification on the other. This is done, of course, not in the overt embrace of madness, but as the usual strategic sequestering of assets in the name of a particular class. Social media has a deep intimacy with this process. The deeply designed addictiveness of some apps, for instance, makes human nervous systems the platform for coding as much as the networks and devices that serve the apps to them. The aim is to design mechanisms that cross between the computer and the human, making weird machines that are both unreasonable and neurotic, and rational and encoded. Perhaps opposing this strategy of governing madness with madness, but through technologies, can have a next slide, please? I think that's it, okay. Can be opposed or reworked by the familiar strategies of reason, by enhancing literacy of different kinds, but also by mechanisms intimate to coding and to networks. The argument of this short lecture, to summarize, is that code literacy must also involve an extended literacy about the subjectival, aesthetic, and political structurations that pass through it. And code literacy must also expand to the epistemologies of code, which are used to naturalize a simple technical view and to legitimize the narrative that computing is a simply technical function. And if we take a wider understanding of code as something that is we can also use the alienness of code, its unreasonable reasonableness, to cut into what we take for granted, to use the strangeness of reason, the madnesses of an overextended rationality, to cut into the forms of traumatic technology that our society has developed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very, very much. It was not what I thought about, but it was very, very mind narrating. It gives. I appreciated also the reference to Nanni Balestrini, to Franco Berardi, and I know that you have collected in one of your book some writings of Marco De Seris. This was a friend of mine some years ago. So this approach is really very interesting. I would like to ask you something about what the work in sociological terms, in historical terms, and the work of volunteer that in the night write some code for Wikipedia, for whatever open source software, which relationship you put between these two kind of work. One is a job, another is not a job, but is a work. This could be, in my opinion, an interesting subject of discussion. But now we leave the microphone to Mark Marino, and I think he would share his screen. So
Yes,
I
let's
stop
see if that works.
my camera. Okay.
Okay, and you can see my slides, I hope.
Yes, perfect.
And my volume's okay?
Yes, also.
Okay. Well, Matthew, thank you for that unbelievable talk. I thought, in contemporary parlance, I thought it was savage. I mean, just that talk in my lived reality is identifying features that have not formally been named. So I really appreciate that. Okay, well, hello, my name is Mark Marino, and I'm the director of the Humanities and Critical Code Studies Lab at the University of Southern California. And this is a little introduction to critical code studies that is maybe more of a pragmatic enterprise. So we left off with Wikipedia with Matthew's talk, and so I'll start with that. Around 2005 or so, I had a hunch, thanks to a number of lessons in semiotics and what Kate Hales was calling media-specific analysis, that we could derive some interesting results by interpreting computer source code. And so I printed out some of the source code to Wikipedia's homepage and brought it to some developers that I knew who had been working in, contemporary web development since about 1998, and seemed that they were at the top of their game for user interface design and things like this. Anyway, they were also friends of mine who had strong humanities oriented backgrounds as well, or good liberal arts education. So we opened up the source code and took a look at it, and as they're reading it, they started to laugh. And up until that point, I think I had taken the assumption that maybe many humanities oriented folks would take, especially if they didn't work in the area of code explicitly, that the code was logical, that code was functional, that code was inevitable, perhaps. And and their laughter was a sign of something else happening in the code. And so I stopped them and I said, well, what do you, I don't understand how this is causing laughter in you. And they said, well, this is a ridiculous way to construct this page. And I asked them to elaborate a little bit about the ins and outs of this, but it was through that interaction that I realized, maybe most presciently or most fully, that there was something more going on in code, more being communicated by code than merely what it did. And again, just to give you some theoretical context for where some of the ideas came from, and again, I don't mean to claim that I'm the first person to read or interpret code, but my own background in it drew heavily, first of all, from lessons in critical legal studies, which again applies critical hermeneutics to a similar kind of code, to legal documents. Critical race theory, again, which has been much discussed in the United States lately. It's become sort of a political football. The book Signifying Nothing by Brian Rotman, where he does an exegesis of the numeral 0. Writing Machines, which I've already alluded to, by Anne Catherine Hales, where she calls for this media-specific analysis. Again, how do you interpret a medium for its unique properties rather than imposing other sets of aesthetics or critical hermeneutics to it from other, that don't belong to it, right? So how do you read, in other words, an object, a digital object, differently than perhaps you'd read a book? What reading strategies can you bring to this? And then later on in the process, I think once I had already formulated this proposal, I was directed from Joe Tabby of Electronic Book Review to Matthew Fuller's collection that was about to come out, called Software Studies: A Lexicon, which I still recommend to everyone in this room. It's a fabulous collection of where people are probing the significance of software keywords and concepts in all sorts of fascinating ways. So I define critical code studies as the application of critical theory or hermeneutics, or you could say continental philosophy if you'd like, but it really doesn't have to be, to the exploration of the extra functional significance of computer source code. Extra here doesn't mean outside of, but growing out of. And critical code studies, this is a later addendum to that definition. Critical code studies does not hold code as its ends, but as an entry point. There should be an "and" there from the English teacher, for explorations of technoculture. So it draws upon, from my background, semiotics, critical theory more broadly, which is what we tend to refer to as most continental philosophy, deconstruction, cultural studies, or maybe I should say from post-structuralism, many of the attendant reading strategies that have grown out of it, whether they're feminisms, womenisms, whether they're thinking about certain branches of Marxism, queer theory, etc. Again, these are not all necessarily bedfellows to begin with, but in the mind of a PhD student, which I was at the time, they seemed like they fit together in complementary ways. So here is an example that I use in the beginning of the book, the introduction of the book, which again you can just access through my website if you don't have the book itself, or the criticalcodestudies.com website. And here's a woman, or a person I'm going to perceive as a woman, holding up a sign, and it seems like it is written in computer source code, right? It seems like it's using code-like things to make an argument, right? It seems to say that there is an audience out there that can read this sign and process it that's not a computer. In fact, this would not necessarily, most people who identify this say that it would not compile, and of course it probably wouldn't. And it seems like she's using C as her language for creating this protest argument that seems like it's increasing the number of protesters slowly until it achieves this corruption-free India. Well, this picture was posted and circulated on various Reddit boards. So the various discussion boards where programmers were discussing the code. However, they weren't discussing sort of the political message behind it as much as they were critiquing her code. And this was, as far as I could tell, a largely male collection of folks, and also it's seemingly a group that grew out of this knowledge worker category that Matthew was just speaking about. And the way that they attack her code, I tend to call encoded chauvinism. I think there's something more at stake to what's being critiqued here. But again, this is also a kind of critique, I think, that is beaten into programmers from their instructors, or shamed into them by a culture that is, again, chauvinistic and won't tolerate certain kinds of inefficiencies and things like that. But again, just the fact that there is a conversation can be had, a political conversation, a social conversation, growing out of code objects, suggests to me that, of course, code has an audience that is not the computer. The computer doesn't need code. The humans need it. And then there are all these attendant significations that come out of code and code-like languages that come out of the cultural exchange and circulation of code amongst different audiences. So by contrast, I offer another example of another GitHub project, the Women on GitHub project, which tries to gather up all of, as many different women who are registered to GitHub as possible. And it creates these kind of sports cards, profile pictures of them that celebrate the number of women in programming. And this is a particular kind of intervention in programming that is also political, like the previous one, although it can be executed. It does create this web page. And as I looked into the source code, it allowed me to sort of reflect on various elements. For example, the number that's in the upper left-hand column, or the upper left-hand part of that image, which is what GitHub assigns to the programmers when they register, which is something that I wouldn't have been aware of had I not looked more into the code. So I think I want to juxtapose these two examples of one that, again, seems explicitly political but can't execute it, and another one that is certainly political with the small p in terms of gender politics, but it is functional. And looking at that code and reading that code in order to get a cultural meaning, not from finding sort of secret variables in it or, function names, but to think about its processes and how the particular signs that tokenize that activity that it's trying to achieve either complement or complicate its intended function, I guess. So sometimes that involves looking at code and finding things that have natural language properties and that are interesting to discuss. So another example that comes from the introduction is this code from the ClimateGate scandal, where climate research group's code was exposed and seemed to be creating the smoking gun of the climate change hoax, as it was posited online on various forums, right? Here's you can see on line 11, a fudge factor. And you can see that line 7, a commented out, applies a very artificial correction for decline. And when this was circulated over various posting boards, again, there was great celebration at finding what seemed to be the hoax encoded. And also you could see the privileging of so a narrative being created that there's a secret set of machinations that are happening, and they're happening at the layer of the code. And all we need to do is expose those. Well, it turns out that this code artifact, the software artifact, is being misread. That what was happening was two sets of data were being put in sync with one another. And for the time being, the person who had to make a chart out of this data was applying a correction so that they could sync the data so that to make a coherent chart. And of course, this code was part of a series of programs that were iterated so that until they got to the point where they didn't have to create this artificial reconciliation. They had reconciled the data sets so that they were coherent rather than trying to perpetrate some sort of hoax on everyone, but that there is a climate gate, or there is a climate change. Climate change itself is incontestable in the data that these people are looking at. They're just trying to create a simple representation of it on a graph. So code can be read, it can be misread, and that's part of my argument, I guess, also in the book, is that this code that is not written for computers, but written for other programmers to read and to interact with and to process, has already become part of our cultural discourse, even if we're misreading it at times. Critical code studies also looks at culture in code. And we can think about that in the earlier case of culture showing up here, not just the culture of Indian political culture, but the culture of those programming in C. But also, it's of course inscribed in the languages that underpin programming languages. So here we have the work of John Corbett, an artist who is using his Cree language, or is trying to create a programming language out of Cree language. And again, this is that you can see in an interview where I discuss this work with him in Computational Culture that Matthew edits. And I just want to throw out one thing, which is, and then on the left, we see this beaded portrait of his grandmother. And when I was talking with John, he was explaining how since the Métis people did not have culturally they didn't have a mathematical formula or abstraction of the mathematics behind creating a spiral. And so, trying to be true to that culture, he created a system for creating these portraits that follows a logic that seems more in concert with Métis notions. So it's not just that the tokens are in a different language, it's that the cultural knowledge being played out in these systems reflects and is informed by the cultural knowledge of the indigenous culture that he's trying to bring into this computational system or systems that he's creating. Also in the book, we were talking about philosophy. I was speaking about earlier with Stefano, and one of the philosophers, media philosophers of our times, who Friedrich Kittler, created a ray tracer, and his ray tracer, which we have some C and some assembly for, we have the source code for it, and again, there are these wonderful repositories, show the work of a philosopher trying to understand the way computational systems simulate the play of light in the natural world. So here's the ray tracer of Himmel and Hölle, or the ray tracer of heaven and hell. And its basic operations are you create a background of floor in sky, right, of the image, and then you take an object and you give it a skin, and then you play with the number of lights that are playing off of that. So it's a way of modeling in computer graphics the way light plays. And I argue in the book that for Kittler, this programming work was part of his philosophy, part of his view of a philosopher's activities, as he came to understand the play of light by its computational simulations. And if you look in his code, you see things commented out. And of course, Kittler didn't write all of this code himself. He worked with other people. But you can see comments that can be translated. Obviously, you can see an evolution of this code over time. But I didn't believe that gave fully a sense of what Kittler was after, because Kittler seemed to privilege getting closer to the machine, which in his formulation is not different than a lot of people. So that would mean working in assembly or maybe that would mean working in binary. But these higher level languages from his formulation take you further and further away from the machine. And so to truly understand it, to understand it and so be able to theorize about it, you would need to be able to operate at that base level. So in part of that work, I looked at some of his assembly. So he's got this matrix transformation code. And again, from anecdotal accounts from speaking to his students or people who are part of this research group, it does seem that Kittler was working on this assembly or assembler code himself. And here's just a little tiny excerpt that I spoke about with my wife. My wife teaches electrical engineering. She's a computer engineer, and she reads assembly or assembler fluently, as it turns out. And I said, well, can you tell me anything about this code that's remarkable? And she said, well, I'll tell you one thing. This programmer really knows his assembly. And I said, I don't know. I'm not sure what you're saying there. And she said, well, he's pipelining it. He's creating some instructions that will be executed while the processor is sort of shuttling around other instructions. And I said, I still don't understand. And she said, well, think about the laundry. When you have the washing machine going and the dryer going, and I know in Italy there aren't not as pervasive use of dryers, so I apologize for the American power excess, energy use excess. But in any case, she said, well, one thing you can do, you know, that a person would do is they might empty the dryer while they're waiting for the washer to finish, so that the dryer will now be empty. Which is ironic because I do the laundry in our family, and I actually never do that. And she said that's essentially what pipelining is doing. It's taking advantage of this system. So I just want to underscore this particular moment, because notice here this commentary that we're making. So I guess the claim I'm making is that Kittler demonstrates his understanding of the machine through pipelining, as evidenced by his assembler code, something I couldn't have known without reading his code. I'm not saying anything about function names at this point. I'm not saying anything about variable names. I'm not saying anything about comments that can be read in natural language. I'm making a claim by reading the code itself that goes beyond what this code does into its larger significance, into its cultural significance, in the way that it reflects the person who's writing this code. And I have to be careful with this, because when I bring this up with programmers and I say, oh, I'm going to read your code, or that's what I do. I read the significance of code. They flash back to their poetry class or their English class or their language class, and they think about, oh, so you're going to interpret this the way you would interpret Boccaccio, the way you'd interpret Shakespeare. My code is not Shakespeare. I've blotted a line programmatically, and there's a lot of shame around professional programmers and their code that I think is instilled from a culture, again, this kind of chauvinistic culture that I've described, that comes out of programming education and higher education, and also online cultures as well, which are fairly toxic, I think. And I say, no, I'm neither looking for necessarily your deep, the poetry of your code, nor am I looking for your signature necessarily, right? Although, okay, again, to some extent, I'm searching for Kittler in this code. Instead, I'm looking for meaning, or perhaps I'm producing meaning, is perhaps a clearer sense in a broader context. So again, just to disabuse us of a couple of assumptions that I think people make, which is that critical code studies can only interpret natural language in code, the comments, the function names, the variables. I think those are easy things to interpret, but that's maybe the low-lying fruit. I also critical code studies doesn't try to find some sort of secret hidden in the code. One of my early readings, I read the code from an art project called the Transborder Immigrant tool, created by Electronic Disturbance Theater 2. And this is code for a project that was to be operated on mobile phones to help border crossers, probably from Mexico into the United States, and again, crossing the border without documentation, in their last mile, once they've entered the United States, so that they could get to a city or get to some water so that they could survive. It's a fascinating art piece, and the collective released their code. And when I read their code after it had been released, I discovered that they were using an interesting name for one of their functions. It was called the water witching, or witching event was the name of it. And water witching or dowsing refers to the folk practice of finding water through the use of sticks. And perhaps you've seen this, or perhaps you can do this. And I found this, of course, very ironic that there was this function named after this when this software uses global positioning systems, and it's operating on a mobile phone, and that it's using this folk practice that, again, to a Western technological eye feels like it's superstition or something like that. But again, the electronic disturbance theater was purposefully challenging that by the naming of their functions. Now, of course, the electronic disturbance theater, when they released their code, they also knew that critical code studies exists. But most searches through code are not that kind of a treasure hunt for something that has been placed, some Easter egg that's been placed in the code for the benefit of a person that they know is looking for it. Most of it is semiotic analysis. And again, if Jameson can read, if Jameson can give us a reading of a hotel, if Stuart Hall and company can read the Sony Walkman, if Matthew Fuller can read trauma photos from Vietnam, then we can read. We don't need to have this turn into an escape room of some sort, right? And also, critical code studies doesn't uncover, and there's no underlying truth. It's not the secret to the software is not in the code by any means. But again, it's based on semiotic interpretation. It combines research with discovery. Again, I think I've learned the hard way that a lot of critical code studies is just rooted in media archaeology, period, full stop. And then, however, I do encourage people, because there is a tendency. One thing we haven't talked about so far in this panel is we haven't talked about software studies more broadly, and we haven't talked about platform studies, for example. And these are wonderful endeavors, but sometimes they tend to be, sometimes when people engage with them, they can involve a kind of nostalgia, software nostalgia. People might even accuse the book 10 Print of having a bit of that. Or they seem to do industrial research for, obsolete technologies. And again, I would, the critical behind the critical code studies, encourages people to use a critical lens or multiple critical lenses in their interpretation, to be self-conscious of the ideological function that they're serving as they explore this code. So I purposefully was trying to separate out critical code studies from again what I saw as at times apolitical endeavors, or endeavors that were not admitting necessarily the philosophical lenses that they were using to look at their software objects. So, and I've also learned that critical code studies is a critical making, that I don't believe that I'm more than any semiotician. I'm not unlocking the meaning. I'm creating the meaning, and also that critical making is a form of critical code studies. So there, again, in recent critical code studies working groups, we've had people who are building software to understand software, and we can see that happens in 10 Print, and it happens in lots of other occasions as well. Not just with software art, but people building processes to understand other processes. And then, of course, it's a radically interdisciplinary project that I once said that someone doesn't have to know how to code to do critical code studies, which I think is true to some extent. But I think in that case, you need a partner with a translator, an interpreter, a guide, someone who lives in those systems. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that's happened in the evolution of critical code studies, is that it was started by someone who was outside this sphere, and then very soon, them being perceived as an interloper or a colonizer or an outsider. Here come the humanities folks. I then had to really work to build bridges to help computer science folks who were in the business of programming understand that they were already engaged in something that for me qualified as a critical code studies, and then to find that shared language so that I'm not trying to explain, espresso to an Italian, so to speak. And then what's next on the agenda, we have these biennial working groups. And so the next one will be happening in 2022, and these are online. They tend to focus around a series of week-long plenaries that take up various themes, from indigenous programming was one of them to I think we'll be looking at some artificial intelligence and machine learning code this coming up year. 2 years ago, we had a feminist AI group. So these are meant to both orient newcomers to the field and then also to invite those who have been invested in it for a considerable amount of time to engage in readings of code. So in addition to those plenaries, we also have we allow people the opportunity to create code snippet threads or code critique threads where they will pose or post a piece of code and invite people to read it critically and to see what we can do through this exploration, or they can raise just another topic if they wish. And again, just as an example, 10 Prints, which we talked about earlier, that discussion or that book initially was born out of a discussion that ties back to Matthew Fuller's book and Nick Montfort's long interest in this piece of code, but also a code studies thread in the first working group, which was in 2010. Let me see. I think that is it. Yep, those are all my slides for right now. So I think I might wrap up my talk there, but we can transition into the rest of the discussion. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Stefano and the organizers for inviting us here.
Thank you very much to you. I think the answer has some question to
Right.
ask.
Right. Thank you. I mean, the talks were very, very interesting and engaging, even for a relatively, sort of kind of an outsider like me, and they were very much complementary as well. So I thought there was something that I could sort of mention and just see how that resonates with your projects and your remarks. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but let's see how it works. So one thing that I've been working with myself for different reasons is let's say the notion of error, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that I've been working in the philosophy of science, and there you do find a role for error in the evolution of scientific ideas. And another thing is that I've been working a little bit on mistakes in reasoning, right? So things like confirmation bias, this kind of biases in reasoning processes, in cognitive processes. And while listening to Matthew's talk, I thought there was, at least on the face of it, a couple of possible connections. One is these ideas, this very strong and widespread, I mean, large notion of unreason. The other one is about this idea of the information somehow exploding in contemporary environments, up to the point that you actually feel something like a very strong pressure to handle this kind of information, and maybe there are tendencies to exploit sort of suboptimal ways to handle the information. That's one possible connection, and I would be happy to see whether you do find some intersection there as well. And also concerning Mark, I also was thinking another way to relate to that. I mean, it's a different route, but possibly that makes sense. So one idea is that when you use the language of computation, you have a tendency to think that there's going to be something correct, exact, predictable, expected in how things will go, and that is not always the case. And I thought in your project try to relate the code to interpretation, for instance, right? So this kind of tools somehow might be also related to sleeps, errors, mistakes, or blind spots, this kind of phenomenon. So sorry, this was very vague, but I thought maybe you can come up with something interesting out of it.
Matthew, you want to take it first? And you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, it's always good to start off a response to a discussion of error with a basic error, right? I mean, that's the primary kind of methodological imperative that I want to bring. So yeah, I was interested in this kind of phrase that I think Mark brought out very well in his talk, which is of building processes to understand other processes, and I think this is a kind of a real commonality between the two discussions that we have, in that one builds an approach, whether it's a kind of epistemic approach, whether it's a social or aesthetic approach, with the intent to understand something, but also to create something, and this work with processes in order to elicit or divulge or invent or to individuate something about a condition is part, I think, part kind of a joint concern, a joint interest in this work. And as Mark says, it involves a lot of a work of collaboration, but it also involves collaboration not with other kinds of person, with other kinds of epistemic practices or other kinds of knowledge. It also implies a collaboration with other kinds of processes, some of which are errors or glitch inducing, or that have other kind of axiomatic capacity. So there's a kind of a collaboration with bodies of ideas, bodies of work, a collaboration with the capacity of different kinds of cultural form to individuate or express or to demarcate or to semiotize certain kinds of ideas. So we're working with we're working with languages. We're working with the way in which different languages or different computational platforms, or the different social forces that articulate themselves through it, have different kinds of capacities to produce certain kinds of formation, certain kinds of experience, whether they're traumatic, punitive, or creative, etc., etc. And I think there's a nice interplay between this way in which different kinds of cultural formation allow for different kinds of production, which may or may not involve error. And there's a lot of gap between error and full functionality. And perhaps we could argue that full functionality, and I think this is something that Mark's talk points towards, is that full functionality rarely exists, or individuates only at certain very kind of unusual moments. But it also, full functionality changes as the software migrates into other contexts, or a kind of logical proposition or a set of axioms move into different kinds of spaces of reasoning. And I think this is, I mentioned Wittgenstein briefly. I mean, this is what he found out over the course of his career, that the meaning of a statement changes according to its location. And that happens in software in very extreme ways, like a line of code will run or will not run. But a line of code may also go on forever. It may produce glitches, it may produce errors, it may produce very interesting kinds of effective incomputability. And one of the things I think we're finding is that these effects of error, of glitch, and so on, are wide social formations. That we experience the effects of computational glitches, or glitches in computational economic social processes, as part of everyday life in the present. And this, the experience of the error unfolding, or the errors in axiomatic processes as they mesh together, is part of a broader understanding in contemporary life, where we have every part of society is building processes to understand other processes, some of which are computational, some of which are articulated in computational ways. But there's a broader exploration of a society that is increasingly computational, that also produces novel kinds of glitch, novel kinds of error that we have to understand culturally. And I think critical code studies has been a kind of crucial way of looking into this space.
I love I love that answer. I'm going to take a slightly different approach, which is, so let's talk about three ways error comes up in critical code studies. One is, unlike any other kind of interpretation that I was trained in, you know, again, I have a literary background, so I'm training poems, and I'm interpreting poems, I'm interpreting dramas, I'm interpreting short stories, novels, etc. I can misread a poem, or I can, let's say I take a phrase to mean something that it turns out, you know, wasn't contemporary with the people who were writing it, or I play upon some ambiguity that maybe is pushing things a bit too far, but it's something that I see in my subjective relationship to these signs. Okay, that's fine. There is some level of correctness in programming. I either know what those tokens do, or I don't, and they have a discernible discrete effect on the system, and it may be unpredictable, and it may vary depending on lots of other systems. You know, in other words, it might be an infinitely complex system that I can't quite trace out how it works, but a lot of times, but I can at least show that it has a discrete effect. And so you can't have an error in that level of your interpretation and have a sustained interpretation. You're either right or you're wrong. And again, that does create a little bit of, raise the stakes a little bit when you're doing the groundwork for critical code studies. There's also a sense that among programmers, when I speak with them, and again, maybe also software artists, you know, again, I have a lot of conversations with Nick Modford, so that might be a good example, that that there's a sense that they formulate it as like, I need to in my mind replicate the processes of the computer. That's how I achieve correctness in my code. That's how I avoid error, is that I understand the way I've created a little simulator, emulator in my mind for how this machine is going to interpret this code, or how it's going to, you know, or how it's going to execute the code once it's compiled, or whatever the system is, right? So I need to get my mind to operate with that discipline of the machine. So the machine actually becomes, in some ways, in this sort of hierarchy, becomes the arbiter of truth, of what's happening here. And then I sort of contrast that with something else, which is when the more recent critical code studies, we've been looking into things like machine learning algorithms for predictive policing and bail setting algorithms. Now, these are complex systems that we've been able to open up. Some of them are open source, so we've been able to look at them a little bit more closely. And someone might say, for example, look at the error that this system created by suggesting that more police was needed in this part of town rather than this part of town, or perhaps even look at the error that was made, because we can find racial discrepancies between how bail is being set among races, again, as formulated in the United States, for example. But again, what I don't see in that, what I worry about in that particular kind of technocentric or effects-centric approach is, you know, obviously, I think we need to challenge the basic premises of software that's being used in these cases. And usually when you start challenging the basic premises, you're challenging the presumptions of the society that, you know, again, take the example of predictive policing, which is largely designed to figure out reasons to allocate more police in one area or another, or more surveillance in one area or another. But again, it's predicated on certain notions of crime, certain notions of civic life, certain notions of what needs to be surveilled, etc. And again, what critical code studies brings to the table is when you can uncover the processes and how, in as much as you can see how they're working accurately, you can see some decisions has been made, and you can challenge its presumptions and then open up that conversation. So in other words, there is an error, there is a glitch, but often that glitch is on fundamental assumptions that again you can get to when you get to that the holy code, the code that only the coders can read. But again, that has very real consequences on people's lives.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so Stefano, you tell me, in terms of time, whether I do have time for something more, or you want
as I said before, it's up to us. It's up to you, in the sense that we have there's no someone arriving and cutting our session. So we have the key. We are chez nous.
So maybe one.
So if another question is
right, one little thing that I wanted to try is the following. This is going to be the last one, I promise. So, by being involved in the organization of this festival, I realized painfully that there is a real divide about what you called, I think, coding literacy, right? So myself, I'm sort of an illiterate. I'm very poor in my coding skills and proficiency. I'm basically entirely naive about that, more or less. So I was wondering. So there is this divide, right? And there are these two sides of in a way. And when we're listening to your talks, I was wondering how you see your project, your project's impact on these two sides of the divide, right? So how do you see your project as somehow changing or contributing the understanding of these two fairly different kinds of people, right? They know different things. They talk different languages in a sense, right? So people like me, basically, they are used to employ tools, and they almost don't realize that there is a coding process behind most of these functions. So, and they still, these people still have lots of the sort of problems that you mentioned, and they might profit by certain elements of understanding. But of course, I mean, these two positions are very different from each other. So I was wondering whether you have a sense that your own project can be articulated in different ways for these two sort of targets. Well, targets is not a nice word, but you get the point.
Yeah, if I could jump in. So on the, I'm always careful about overly enforcing that the divide, whether it exists or doesn't exist. But certainly those people who know how to program and those who don't, and there are people who are professionals and those who aren't. They're amateurs and they're etc. But in my experience, the Critical Code Studies project works like this. On the one hand, there's kind of interdisciplinary outreach that's happening that's meant to help those who are involved in programming think about cultural context and implications to what's being programmed. So hopefully, after someone, I don't know, reads an article that examines a piece of code, that might change the way they think about programming, or perhaps, again, there's like an ethical dimension, perhaps, that maybe is the easiest one to sort of bring into their programming practice. Not that programmers are unethical, but just to think about implications of what they're programming. And I think we've already started to see the effects of that, not just on the code level, but in the software studies incursions of groups like the Algorithmic Justice League and things like that, who are who are trying to make interventions with programmers at the level of at least the software, if not the code. So it's sort of helping programmers think about programming in different ways, and those who teach programming to think about it in different ways. And on the other hand, it is to open up programming to the humanists, to those who are in the business of interpreting things, but maybe more importantly, to help offset an economic balance. I was talking earlier with Stefano about, okay, so now he becomes a programmer at some point. Again, I don't mean to reveal his life story, when philosophy is not necessarily paying all the bills, but I of course have no reason to hold any kind of hierarchy related to those two enterprises. And so I've had to do a lot of work to help the humanists who come into like a critical code studies working group understand that what they're bringing, the ability to make and find meaning in semiotic objects is of equal value, and something that those who are whose fundamental business is making things perhaps on a commercial level for their living, making software run for their living, they almost don't have time to entertain that kind of work. They don't have time they often don't have time to stop for that kind of reflection, even though they might be doing it all the time, like, oh, I've got to deal with this code from this, this person down the hall who always writes spaghetti code, and now I've got to deal with it. So they're dealing with some level of that, but they're not necessarily in the business of finding, making, reflecting on meaning, which again, I hold tremendously valuable. So the literacies, I guess, or the need for bridging those literacies to me goes back and forth. It's helping the humanists understand how the code works. It's helping those who are involved primarily in programming understanding the nature of signification, implication, cultural discourse, and how it emerges. And again, maybe the easiest, like I said, the most practical one that would be wonderful to share is again just keeping these ethical questions always at maybe in the background processes of their minds as they're developing their code.
Yeah, I think, another way of framing that in a slightly more controversial way would be to say that the most computer illiterate people on the planet are computer scientists, precisely because they focus, or they're trained to focus solely on a kind of a positive implementation of a particular programmatic idea. Now, of course, that's a very abrupt position to take, but it might be worth thinking about, given that we live in a society which is increasingly determined by computational means, but there is no analysis of that society built into the education and working practices of computer scientists. Given that we live in a computational society, there should be social knowledge of that society built into the computational practice. Another way of cutting into that would be to say, actually, there are vast numbers of different kinds of practices that engage with computational processes. You think of the vast number of YouTubers, for instance, who spend enormous amounts of time analyzing and understanding the algorithms of YouTube in order to get their material higher, or to criticize the mode of operation of the platform. We can also say that people who are absolutely not coders primarily, but that use computers as part of their daily practice. I'm thinking, for instance, of architects whose working practices have become absolutely computational, and think about buildings, work with buildings in highly computational ways through the way that they design and articulate and understand space. So, I think one of the things we might want to do is to think about the different kinds of knowledges that could be brought together to think about computation in the present. Some of which will be people who ostensibly know how to code, but others will be people who know what computing means in the wider society, and that will mean kind of quite odd-shaped alliances and uncanny connections between different kinds of working practice, different kinds of experience.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. Although I think your first claim reveals the fact that, as far as I know, you're not married to a computer engineer, because well, again, because part of my work again has been this strange outreach work, right? Where early on, and I've written about this. I found myself alienating what I was trying to myself and the whole program from the groups of really thoughtful, intelligent language developers, for example, who found the language of post-structuralist theory to be they had those sort of so-called reactions to it, right? They found it to be some sort of humanistic chicanery. Okay, well, we can go toe to toe on that if we wish. Me and those computer I can make the case for its value if I wish. Or again, a lot of my work was a suspicion that they were already, that again, people like Donald Knuth, that like not even him, it's like, maybe even Dijkstra, I don't know, that Grace Hopper, that there were people working at the level of the positivist engineer trying to make something better, that did have a sense of wider connotation, right? I mean, maybe their projects fail, maybe they, again, maybe they're not being fully questioning the enterprise, but they were engaging at an epistemological level with the nature of code. And I more importantly, I needed their investment in the conversation, I guess, is really what it is. But again, that said, I love what you say about architecture. Again, I say let's bring the people who know about choreography. Let's bring the people who know about cooking. let's bring the people. Let's bring my grandmother, who knew about knitting, into the conversation. Right? Yeah. I think you're right that but again, look at how that Enzo's initial sort of putting himself forward, though. Again, there was a little bit of an apologetic side to that, right? Oh, you mean you're only bringing philosophy to the table? Well, again, there's a way that tendency to privilege the programming side of things. Again, it makes sense because we are talking about code. Obviously, it'd be good to know about code to talk about it. But again, it's become so clear to me that the art of interpretation is so hard to achieve and get right that again but completely discounted, most conversations. Anyway, I'm preaching to the choir here, I know, with you, Matthew, but
thank you.
I just remember at the first seconds of our conversation, Mark asked to me, but which kind of person are participating, are seeing and watching will we be watching our session? And the answer was, we do not have we have no idea, because the aim of this festival is exactly to put person together, person coming from different sides. So person from University of Torino, but from philosophy department or from computer science department, because in the organization there are we have also physics department. It's not so easy to understand how the physical part of computation comes in the discussion, but it's clearly important, because what you have said about errors in machine, it's clear that error in interpretation is something, but error in a physical mechanism is something different. There is no interpretation. It's just something that cannot, how can I say, cannot, there are laws of physics. You cannot go outside of physics law. So it cannot be an error. No, it's just something that you don't think about. But it's not the machine. The computer cannot be wrong as a machine, because it's following the physics law. But sorry, I would ask you to answer to three little questions if you are not in hurry, if you are not tired. The three questions are about past, present, and future of computer code studies. So, which have been the effects of cultural code studies on students, on programmers, on politicians, on artists? Second question, is computer code studies fashionable today, still fashionable? Because it was 20 years ago and 10 years ago, and is it now? It is fashionable for us in Italy, but is it in London and in San Diego? And it's come to the question, are critical code studies worth teaching now? Or it's something more or less acquired? They are part of our culture. They are part of the encyclopedia, and no need to push on this. Third question about future. Do some of the, let's say, recent facts, like machine learning, AI trying to create code or text or stories, change something in critical code studies? There is another subject on the table, or not, or we are just humans playing another game.
Yeah, I guess I might take first tack at these questions if I could get them. Yeah, it is it fashionable? I'm perhaps the worst person to ask about that, because I have an investment in this field existing, and whether something's fashionable or not is hard for me to say. There does, from my point of view, there does seem to be a movement towards talking about algorithms critically and machine learning. So actually, a few of these ideas go together. So I've seen people writing about critical algorithm studies. I've seen people say things like critical artificial intelligence studies. I saw recently formulated in a paper that will come out by Rita Rayleigh. I think that sometimes people think that to contribute knowledge, to be a knowledge worker, if we could adapt that term in the world of academia, it's not enough to continue a line of work. You've got to brand your new idea, again, much like critical code studies did, and that's the only kind of intervention you can make. So again, this is not to criticize any, but like Kevin Brock wrote a book called Rhetorical Code Studies. So I think if you feel like your job is to brand something so that you can be known by it, so that you can then get a job, then perhaps no form of study will ever be continuously fashionable. You'll just have to keep renaming things endlessly. From my point of view, there's been the field of the work that I'm hoping to see happen is still so nascent. We've done a few things. There are a few initial gestures and a few a few techniques so far that we've developed, and in the course of that time, the good news is that the initial fundamental proposition seems to be accepted more broadly by people. I no longer have to spend all of my time arguing about whether this is something that could be fruitful. There's, does code have a cultural dimension? Most people accept that basic proposition once you explain it to them without any. Again, I used to have heated arguments with people just to explain the initial proposition. But again, even if you look back through the working groups, we've read so few pieces of code and done made so little progress so far that it shows me that there's much more work to do. And again, those bridges we were talking about making between critical code studies and programmers and computer scientists and those sorts of folks. I mean, that's like a Cold War, or not a Cold War, but it feels a little bit like something that needs recurrent summits and congresses just to keep fostering those conversations and creating a shared language. And also share what I have seen recently is people take like the feminist AI group by Christine Minders, taking these sorts of ideas and these enterprises to a broader community that's not even in the academic world or the professional programming world. She's bringing it to community members who may or may not be trained on a technological level, or even necessarily have a college education, so that she can have these conversations with what we would call stakeholders of the most broad variety. So I see a lot of work that has to happen from that point of view. So yes, it is quite possible that the person who writes the book Critical Code Studies could never fundamentally make the argument that it is either going to be unfashionable, that it isn't valuable, that we shouldn't put our resources in this. I will say this. You mentioned machine learning. And I think there's a tendency to mythologize machine learning and to pretend that since it's code that's writing code, we can never fully know this code. I think that's a specious argument fundamentally. In our initial, again, when we went into predictive policing and we found some open source code for machine learning algorithms, again, we haven't looked extensively into the entire coding. There's a piece of open source software called CivicScape. And we were looking into the code that deals with the training of that algorithm. And we discovered aspects of it that we wouldn't have known otherwise. There would have been no way of knowing without looking at the code. Again, I think a lot of times people sort of reduce what I'm doing to I'm only looking at the textual signifiers without them being executed. I think that's a little reductionist. But my point is, it is perhaps in the interest of those who create this kind of software, who sell this kind of software, to promote that illusion that there is something called that machine learning defies our examination. I think that would create a very comfortable space for people to live in. But again, as someone who's started to look at the details of this, of the programs that we use, again, in as much as I can understand those systems, there's nothing illegible about it. It's not magic, and it doesn't create a barrier to our cultural analysis just because it is a system that grows and develops. I mean, again, just like other things, it may be very hard, again, very complex for us to track the effects of its system, but that does not mean that we can't. And again, I've seen people's work like Catherine Griffiths, who's in Michigan, who's creating visualizations as just one small way of understanding the way of us examining critically the way machine learning algorithms work. And again, I've had some initial success just looking at the code. So I would say fruitful past, exciting present, plenty of room in the future would be my terse answer to those three.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think these are very good responses from Mark. I think the best thing would be to avoid to become fashionable at any point, right? I mean, there's nothing worse in some sense, there's a dreadful fate. I think one thing I would add would be that, that I think there has been a great kind of blossoming of work on the conditions of digital society, digital politics, digital economies, and so on in the last 2 decades. And I think it's been really good. One of the things I think as the kind of debate has gone on to what are popularly called algorithms, that is specifically machine learning technologies, AI, and so on, there's a tendency to frame the debate in terms of ethics, and this way of framing it, I think, is understandable in that these things have consequences for people, and so they have a relationship to interpersonal relations, which is the kind of primary ground of ethics. But I also see that there's a long history of ethics being a branch of philosophy that's very readily co-opted by corporations and governments, because it cites relations between people at the scale of the interpersonal. Now, a lot of these systems that we're talking about, specifically around policing, the prison industrial complex, the military, and so on, they're not really about the interpersonal. They're primarily about politics. They're about large-scale formations of power and how they relate at the individual level, at the societal level, at the level of the design of weapon systems, of the perceivability and knowability of different kinds of phenomena on the planet, and the ability to act upon them, and the construction of means by which certain actors have the ability to act in those systems. So I think we need to reframe the debate away from the question of ethics to a question of politics. And that means that there has to be a substantial change in the imaginary of what these systems are, and a different range of actors that are involved in shaping them and calling them to account, as well as new ways of inventing these systems. If they're just kept at the level of ethics, they're always kept at a certain very thinned down, very sparse understanding of what these systems might be and how they can be understood. If we understand them more broadly, then we can also open up new ways of thinking technologically, which I think is to the benefit of computing as well as of the wider society.
Matthew, that's a beautiful answer. I want to share one more thing that I think relates to Stefano's question, and that's recently there's been the advent of books like Aesthetic Programming by Jeff Cox and Winnie Soon as just one small, and where they're bringing in Althusser, and I mean, again, they have kind of it's a politically informed programming instruction manual that can introduce, and again, just systematically, we have room in education for these computer programming for non-majors. That's a popular course taught at many universities. But the idea of a programming manual that brings the political into its enterprise from square one is the beginning of what I think will be a really fruitful conversation as well.
Okay, I think that we can now it's falling down here in Rome. Once again, I thank you very, very, very much for being here, for having been here with us. And I hope that in the next edition of CodeFest 2022, we'll be together again. But I don't know if it will be in Turin or if it will be in Rome but I hope really to continue this conversation in presence.
Okay. Well, Stefano, thank you for having us. And there's one more thing I have to say, which is, as a product of the Marinos, the Battiantis, the Gallianos, or the Gagliardis, and the Gallos. It's nice to have a kind of homecoming. So I appreciate it.
Okay. Okay. Bye bye to all,
Ciao.
and see you later.
Have a nice day or a nice evening.